Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video we're going to be looking at the three pieces of downloadable content that have been released for Bioshock Infinite. Clash in the Clouds, an arena combat mode available for $5, and Burial at Sea Parts 1 and 2, which you'll find for $15 a pop. I'm going to be talking about how people feel about Infinite a year after its initial release as well. This video is just full of goddamn spoilers, though, especially for Burial at Sea, since I want to discuss the ending. Clash in the Clouds is mostly spoiler-free, but if you haven't played Burial at Sea, let me start off by saying that if you enjoyed Infinite, you will almost certainly enjoy its expansion and ultimate conclusion. And if you hated Infinite, there's nothing in Burial at Sea that'll change your mind. This video is intended for three audiences, then. People who have played Burial at Sea, people who don't care about spoilers, though you should, and people who just want to hate-watch content about Infinite. Let's get into it. It's been a year since Infinite was released, and I still haven't seen any modern game provoke such an incredibly entrenched, divided response from the gaming community. There's a major disconnect between average players, who you'll find in the Steam reviews section and more casual review formats, and the parts of the gaming community who consider themselves more serious gamers and more serious game analysts. Namely, almost everyone I've talked to in person and the vast majority of Steam user reviews loved the game to pieces, had a wonderful time playing it, and are excited to see it reach its conclusion. Then there's an extremely vocal but sizable minority who hate Infinite without reservation or compromise. Not all of them. There's plenty of people like Aaron Signal's Campster who dislike Infinite for a lot of well-considered reasons, but there is a ferocity to the criticism of Infinite that I find bizarre. I talked for 30 minutes in my System Shock to Bioshock retrospective about why I think Infinite's a worthwhile game, and I'm not going to retread. But if we're going to talk about Clash in the Clouds, a combat-only DLC, we've got to talk about what people have been saying about Infinite in the year since its release. One of the most common criticisms about Infinite is that its combat is somehow shallower than previous games, influenced by Call of Duty, and lacking the strategic gameplay that previous titles had. No one really asked for Clash in the Clouds, and the fact that one of the essentially two pieces of DLC for the main game is totally divorced from the plot of the main game is a tremendous disappointment. But it does shake up the conversation about Infinite's combat systems, if you're willing to appreciate it as a playground of violence in which to more broadly experience those systems. Clash in the Clouds gives you 4 arenas in which to fight progressively harder waves of enemies, mixing up every variety of enemy in the game in a well-balanced assortment that requires the player to think very tactically about their environment and their strategies. Every weapon, upgrade, and vigor are available to the player between waves, and the latter two categories are available for purchase with money you'll earn beating the waves, looting enemies, and meeting special blue ribbon victory conditions. And most importantly, the difficulty is locked at hard. To prepare for Burial at Sea, I replayed Infinite in 1999 mode, and was delighted by how much it changes the dynamic of the game. If you play on normal or lower, it's understandable that you make a comparison to Call of Duty. You can get through the whole game using just iron sights if you wanted, and if you're handy with games, you wouldn't really have much trouble doing so. The lower difficulties really are balanced towards casual players and those unfamiliar with shooters, which is great for those players. There's no reason to be elitist about a game making concessions for new or unskilled players. Infinite is plot-heavy and plot-dependent. If they didn't make it possible for the average to below-average players to finish that story, they'd really be shooting themselves in the foot. This game cost a lot of goddamn money to make, and they need those casual players to recoup the investment. So if you played on normal difficulty as a seasoned gamer, it's not going to be tactically demanding. 1999 mode throws all that out the window. It's not that 99 mode is extremely difficult, it's not. But it makes you much more vulnerable and much more dependent on exploration. When I played it on 1999 mode, I was astonished at how it changed the pacing of the game. I used traps more, I found exploration more rewarding, I finally bothered to learn vigor combos, and the pacing shifted towards something that much more closely resembles the original Bioshock. 1999 mode changes, mostly, how the game requires the player to engage with it, and changes it for the better. I didn't feel like combat was shallow when I played it on normal difficulty, but neither did it place the same tactical demands on the player as previous System Shocks or Bioshocks. So, Clash in the Clouds. Locked in at hard difficulty, which is pretty close to 99 mode, you'll find yourself having to think very tactically about the arenas you're in and how to juggle the different enemy types. You'll have to carefully choose your weapon loadout, attempt to stagger the pace at which you engage with the enemies, and if you find yourself amenable to the arcade nature of the DLC, Clash gives you the opportunity to really see Infinite's combat firing smoothly on all cylinders. Infinite's combat has always had a more fast-paced emphasis than previous Shocks, and after playing Clash in 1999 mode, I'm starting to feel that visceral immediacy of combat in Infinite is very much about the simplified level design. System Shock and Bioshock are about the environment first and foremost, telling a story through art and architecture as much as any explicit narration. Combat encounters, as a result, are arranged based on your engagement with the level architecture and the way that the player chooses to explore. Think of the introduction of spider splicers in Fort Frolic in Bioshock 1. Suddenly you've got a multi-story shopping concourse filled with dark corners and corpses that you have to explore thoroughly, so they hide live enemies among the corpses and throw enemies on the ceilings. Infinite is about the story. Exploration isn't the focus. Presentation and forward motion of the player and plot is. So combat encounters take less time and are more oriented to a player's reactions as a gamer. Every new area in Infinite is more like a gun puzzle than an original flavor Bioshock's relatively naturalistic combat pacing. Combat is fundamentally arena-based in Infinite, giving you the conflict phase, loot phase pacing, necessitating the audio cue that combat is over and you can go about your business. Clash of the Clouds just takes the combat and combat pacing style that's already in Infinite and gives you the opportunity to play around with it. Each of the 4 arenas takes a different architectural aesthetic present in Infinite and optimizes it for arcade-style play. I'm hesitant to say that it's actually worth $5, but if you got the season pass, you're basically getting $10 off Burial at Sea and this thrown in for free. There's also, tangentially, the thrill of completing blue ribbon challenges. Some of them are fun, some seem arbitrary, and the best ones force you to think about the arena in a very specific way. But there's 60 of them, and a few of them seem pretty close to impossible. It's telling that according to global Steam achievement stats, only 0.2% of players have done all 60. That number seems high. Clash of the Clouds also gives you access to the Colombian Archaeological Society, an extras gallery in the form of a very small explorable level. You can listen to all the game's cover songs, like its awesome version of Soft Cell's Tainted Love, see some gorgeous concept art of things I wish I'd seen in the main game, watch a small selection of cut and behind-the-scenes content, and view models of all the major characters. They're unlockable with cash you get defeating the waves, and it takes almost 25 grand to unlock it all, but you'll get 25 grand pretty easily by playing all 4 arenas, even if you only play them once. There's some new audio logs from Rosalind Lutece as well, available through a tear created when you unlock both Lutece models. Frivolous, but interesting, which is pretty much the Clash in the Clouds experience. Burial at Sea is anything but frivolous. It returns to Rapture, the first Bioshock setting, in a way that finishes the themes of Infinite and integrates them with the plot of the earlier games. I think it does a profoundly good job with it, too. Instead of reviewing Burial at Sea for people who are considering playing it, I'm going to talk in detail about the goings-on of Burial at Sea, what I liked, what I thought worked, what I thought didn't, and try to put the finale's twists into context with the rest of the series. Spoilers is what I'm saying. Spoilers, left and right, and up and down, so if you haven't played Burial at Sea, let's part ways now until you do. I'm serious. Not knowing the twists makes these games a lot more fun. Alright then, fair warning is fair warning. Burial at Sea Episode 1 puts you right back in the shoes of, in a manner of speaking, Booker DeWitt. Now, at the end of Infinite, Elizabeth drowns Booker at the moment he chooses to become Comstock, erasing the millions of variations of the suffering he causes. Elizabeth's born from those universes blink out, one by one. So what's she doing here? Well, not every Booker is destroyed by the Purge. An after-credits scene shows Booker entering the room where Anna's crib is kept, though cuts out before it explicitly shows whether Anna is restored to him in full to raise as a normal girl. This is one of the major plot holes, folks say, but that's not entirely accurate. Every Booker from before the baptism would still be alive. It's just that singular moment of baptism that the events of Infinite hinge on. Booker would still be a war veteran, still be a detective, and in many universes still have Anna. He'd probably still be a drunk and a gambler, too, but he'd only be Booker, and nothing more. It's his religious conversion that gives rise to Comstock and Columbia. Elizabeth, however, is like the Luteces. She exists at many points in time and in many variations of time, before the drowning, during the drowning, around the drowning. When she drowns Booker, she destroys herself, but there's no limit to what she can accomplish before that moment, and a moment can last an eternity if she wants it to. And she isn't just a she. There are so many Elizabeths, and they all know what the other ones are up to. One of her, the one who traveled with you in Infinite, is conspicuously absent from the drowning scene, and it's pretty clear that it's her who walks into Booker's office in the underwater city of Rapture on December 31st, 1958, the eve of the attack on the Kashmir restaurant, whose wreckage you pick through in Bioshock 1's opening level. So begins the opening act of Burial at Sea, a noir-flavored tour through a section of Rapture before the fall, a resplendent Art Deco paradise beneath the ocean. It's a real thrill for long-time players of the series. It is impossible not to imagine what Rapture was like before it succumbed to its own sins, and Burial at Sea delivers incredibly winningly on that front, letting you take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, if you stop and listen to all the background conversations, to really take in the cultural and artistic splendor of Rapture at its height. A recurring criticism of Burial at Sea Episode 1 is that it's, quote, like a museum tour somehow, artificial and bereft of engagement. I strongly disagree. Like the opening moments of Infinite as you work your way towards the raffle, what you're seeing is incredibly careful, deliberate stagecraft. I love live theater, and I have a particular appreciation for technical theater. How to use limited resources in a limited environment to convey an emotion, a mood, set up an entire aesthetic with as few resources as possible. Stagecraft is all about answering that question. It's rarely grounded in realism, like movies and television and books frequently are. Visual design for live theater has a totally different, unique set of challenges and concerns. Visual design for video games, especially modern titles whose production expenses are so enormous, face a lot of the same challenges of using limited resources to maximum effect that live theater does. What you're seeing then is stagecraft, beautiful, hugely competent, larger-than-life stagecraft. Realism is not a mandate, and Bioshock, not the first game, not the second game, and certainly not Infinite, has never gotten much value out of realism. That's part of the reason that it's such an iconic series. It goes beyond what's reasonable to deliver what's spectacular. Seeing Rapture at its height isn't a museum tour, it's a play for the player's benefit. Sure, that might hit the wrong notes for some players who want a grounded environment with a lot of interactivity, but those players would be ignoring what it really is a remarkable accomplishment in visual art. Keep in mind, everything you see is made out of math, the math of programming code. It takes hundreds of dollars of cutting-edge technology to even display this world for your amusement. I'd encourage a little appreciation of that. It also gives the player an opportunity to get to know Elizabeth again, colder this time, more enigmatic. DeWitt pretty immediately spots that she doesn't belong there, isn't a Rapture gal, but what does she want? The noir theme dovetails pretty perfectly with this. A sense of dread and apprehension resonates softly beneath the glittering spectacle of Rapture. Once you've conned your way into getting an invitation to Cohen's club, by way of one of the ornate bunny masks that any Bioshock player will be intimately familiar with, you'll have a face-to-face encounter with Sander Cohen while he's still a recognizable human being. This younger Cohen is great. He's still unhinged and vain, but he doesn't seem truly psychotic yet. Just incredibly coked out. Spliced up in Rapture's parlance, but someone on the writing team's been around drugs before because it is goddamn spot on. There's a great bit of foreshadowing as well when you introduce yourself as DeWitt, and Cohen's tone is slightly skeptical. And he knows Elizabeth. This gets confirmed in Episode 2. You'll find a poster of Elizabeth calling her the Songbird of Rapture, and she reveals then that she'd worked with Cohen for 2 months to get a lead on Sally, the little girl the Booker DeWitt you're playing as lost and is now being pressured by Elizabeth to recover. Cohen asks you both to dance for him. It's impossible not to think of the scene on the boardwalk of Battleship Bay where young Elizabeth dances with such a carefree lightness of soul. Now, here you are, waltzing for a madman beneath the dark and crushing weight of the ocean and your crimes. Cohen demands honesty in the dance, but Elizabeth isn't ready to be honest with DeWitt yet. She's waiting for a moment. Cohen shocks you both into unconsciousness out of frustration, throws you in a bathysphere, and sends you into the sunken department store where Fontaine, now Atlas, and his gang of thugs have been exiled. Elizabeth's moment is not that far off. Now is where the meat of gameplay begins, and you find yourself in a part of Rapture that's a little ahead of its time, dark and broken and populated by the crazed splicers you're already familiar with. The department store setting is a great choice. It's a perfect microcosm of the kind of things that make Bioshock so memorable and creepy when you see them twisted and destroyed. Idealistic consumerism, grandeur of architecture, little touches of individual ambitions and personality. It would have made a fine level for either of the first 2 Bioshocks. It also better approaches the combat pacing of those earlier games, with major changes to the way DeWitt engages with combat. On all levels of difficulty, maybe excluding easy, this DeWitt is considerably more vulnerable. Enemies do more damage, your ammunition capacity is seriously reduced, but the ability to carry all the weapons you find returns from previous games. It makes splicers feel much more dangerous, it makes scavenging much more important than it was in Infinite, maybe excluding 99 mode, and forces the player to adopt the same process of careful exploration through a consistently dangerous environment that earlier Bioshocks encouraged. There's no arena battle feeling here. This return to Rapture is a return to the original flavor of exploring Rapture as well. Level design is also consistent with previous Bioshock titles. If you're just following your quest arrow, you've got about 45 minutes of content in Fontaine's department store, but if you explore the different departments thoroughly, you'll get a full 45 minutes to an hour on top of that. The amount of optional exploration is incredibly welcome. And lockpick-intensive chests are more rewarding to open than in Infinite. You'll get infusions and audio logs on top of the flat cash you'd get from the chests in the main game. As you go along, Elizabeth will reveal her ability to open tears, though I'm going to say right here that I have no explanation for pulling through Samurai. That one's as much of a head-scratcher to me as it is to you. And DeWitt will talk about how he came to look after Sally. Sally was one of Rapture's many orphans, and when she started showing up at DeWitt's office, he took her in. Something about Sally made him feel tender as DeWitt is able to be, at least. She was taken from him while he was gambling. Not sold, just taken. And DeWitt still carries the head of her doll, Sarah, as a sort of reminder. Elizabeth and DeWitt find her in the vents, and if you know the original Bioshock, you know what that means for Sally. After closing all the vents but one, Elizabeth demands that they turn the heat up to flush her out. DeWitt refuses, he won't hurt her, so Elizabeth herself cranks up the heat to above maximum to force Sally out of hiding. It's a cruel and callous thing to do. There's a steel and a hatred in Elizabeth that wasn't really there in Infinite's main campaign when she does it. Sally summons a Big Daddy to her aid, and after bringing down the Big Daddy in a very tense and difficult boss fight, DeWitt tries to pry her from the pipes. Here's where shit gets real for DeWitt. Struggling with Sally, he remembers how he came to Rapture. You get a flashback to a familiar scene, the scene where Booker tries to break his deal with Comstock and Anna's pinky figure is cut off. But not from Booker's perspective, it's from Comstock's. And here Anna loses much more than a pinky. The doll's head isn't just a reminder of Sally, it's a reminder of what he did to Anna. Elizabeth feels the pain of all versions of herself, and she knows what this Comstock did. After that Anna's decapitation, Comstock had the Lutece twins send him back to Rapture, to forget, like Booker forgets when the Luteces send him to Columbia and drag him onto the rowboat. With Anna dead, there's no Elizabeth. Booker never comes to Columbia, and the purge that would destroy all the other Comstocks would never occur in his timeline. In Episode 2, Elizabeth refers to him as the last Comstock. Since she can see behind all the doors, all the possibilities and variations, she can see this Comstock clear as day. So she came for him. For revenge. In all the other universes, it was Booker who kills Comstock, and to stop Comstock from ever existing, Elizabeth has to drown Booker, her true father, her only friend. She never got a personal revenge on Comstock. This Comstock was her one opportunity to make him pay, at her hands, for what he did. So she burned Sally to get it, to make him remember and understand the pain he caused, and to suffer for it. The Big Daddy that DeWitt puts down doesn't stay down, though, and Episode 1 ends with DeWitt Comstock being disemboweled in first person by the Big Daddy's drill, blood splattering Elizabeth's cold, cold stare as she gets what she thinks that she wanted. Terrors, Elizabeth said in the main campaign, are a form of wish fulfillment. Episode 2 opens in a wish, a dream, the Paris of Elizabeth's imagination. Her favorite painters paint the Eiffel Tower, everyone knows her name, she has friends at last, the air is filled with warm breeze and music and light. It's beautiful. It really is a beautiful dream. It seems, at first glance, to be real, but something just doesn't sit right. You go in a bookshop, as Elizabeth, since you're playing her in this episode, ask for a book, and the shop owner laughingly replies that that book hasn't been written yet. Everyone knows you. Every last person. Even the papers have your picture on the front page. Even the birds sing along with the joyous music. It's not really Paris. It's the Paris that Elizabeth wished for year after year while locked away in the tower. And now that her powers are, well, infinite, she could stay there for eternity if she wanted to. They've come across a booth asking, once again, bird or cage. But then the booth's proprietor asks, why not have both? Elizabeth can do anything that she can imagine, even construct this beautiful cage for herself. Well, you're about to find out why not. Sally's there. And when you recognize Sally, keeping in mind that all Elizabeths know what the other ones are up to, the dream begins to turn dark, collapses. Elizabeth is capable of such warmth and delight, and all of it is on display in her resplendent fantasy Paris. That same warmth cannot abide by what she did to Sally. She chases, you chase, Sally through the collapsing dream, through Booker's office door, to a room where the guilt of what she's done completely overwhelms her. Elizabeth can have both the bird and the cage. The cage is not her tower anymore, can't be Paris. Her cage is the knowledge that, when you come down to it, she's not much better than Comstock. She'll still sacrifice an innocent girl out of selfishness. She's free to do anything, but nothing is meaningful if she doesn't right her wrong, if she doesn't repay the debt. So you wake up in Rapture next to Comstock's body. Atlas is there, stealing Sally for his own gain. Atlas tells his crony to kill you. Then, suddenly, quietly, Booker is there, telling you exactly what to say to get Atlas to back down. Not from stealing Sally, just from murdering you outright. A deal is struck, you help Atlas escape, but get back to Rapture, and the girl is yours again. Supposing Atlas, who's actually Frank Fontaine if you remember your Bioshock, lives up to his end of the deal. You're struck on the head, and when you wake up, Booker is gone. But he's on the radio. But he's not really Booker, either, just a hallucination of sorts. As you make your way out of the Shattered Toys department, you find out why. The Big Daddy that killed Comstock killed you too. The Elizabeth you traveled with in Infinite in Episode 1 died at the end of Episode 1, was knocked back onto a piece of rebar that pierced her heart. Since you died here, well and truly died, the only way to come back was to give up your nebulous existence and collapse, from her connection to the many Elizabeths in many worlds with infinite powers down to one, One frail, mortal, singular Elizabeth. Your ability to see the myriad possibilities behind the doors is gone. Your ability to open tears is gone. Your memories of it, like Booker and Comstock when they crossed between universes as a single consciousness, are gone. Mostly. The Booker that you talk with over the course of the game is a figment of your imagination, constructed from the fragments of memory you do have. Remember, Elizabeth could see every possible way that this could end. So when Booker sits in his chair and tells you what to say to Atlas, it's not advice, it's prior knowledge of the one conversation that won't end with a bullet in your brain. Elizabeth knows that it isn't Booker, but the idea that Booker would be there to help her is comforting. It's also why the Elizabeth from the main game isn't there at Booker's drowning. She's dead. Already dead, here in Rapture. When that Elizabeth asks, "Are you sure you want to do this?" at the last lighthouse in the main game's climax, she disappears. Burial at Sea, Episode 1, is where she disappears too. She knows she has to drown Booker, that it's inevitable, but if she dies, there are millions of other Elizabeths ready to do the job. The tricky thing is that if Elizabeth in Episode 2 was every Elizabeth that there is condensed down to one, there'd be no one to drown Booker. Which is a problem, plot-wise, and probably the biggest plot hole I can find in the narrative. It's better to think of Elizabeth as breaking off a chunk of herself from the whole, the most vital, truest part into the mortal form you play as in Episode 2. That way, Elizabeth the interdimensional super-being dies when Booker drowns, and Elizabeth the woman dies with Rapture. But that's getting a bit ahead of myself. With that twist straight up front at the very beginning, Episode 2's gameplay portions begin, and it's immediately clear that the experience of playing Elizabeth is going to be totally unlike playing as Booker or Comstock, who both solve their problems with blood and pain. Booker is a strong, ferocious war hero, and Comstock is a frail, battered hired gun. Each character's personality is reflected in the mechanics of how you, the player, control them. So too with Elizabeth. You can play through the entirety of Episode 2 without killing a soul. In fact, you're explicitly challenged to do so in the episode's 1998 mode, a reference to the first Thief game. Elizabeth has no shield, is incredibly easy to kill, and excels at stealth. The stealth mechanics are well implemented, but they take a little away from the Rapture experience. In all other Bioshocks, you could walk around and look at things freely once the shooting was done and the smoke clears. With stealth, you're constantly skulking in the shadows and peeking around corners. You just don't have the opportunity to stand and stare the way you do in other Bioshocks, which is a bit of a shame because the game is unbelievably gorgeous in its color palette, lighting, textures, and architecture. It deserves to be stared at. You'll be creeping through it instead. There wouldn't really be a better way to handle Elizabeth as a player, however, since in the main game in Episode 1, most of what you would do is creep and hide and toss you useful things in the shadows. Lockpicking minigames are back as a function of the new perspective as well, and if you played Oblivion, the fourth Elder Scrolls game, you've already got this covered. It's the same puzzle. A little easier and much more stylishly executed, granted, but this is a familiar puzzle to longtime gamers. The touch, though, where any time Elizabeth has to interact with something technical, she sees it as if out of the pages of a book, was brilliant. A great way to tie character perspective to player perspective, and the visual shifting of coded words to readable letters as she translates them in real time is also excellent. I've seen some people saying that stealth should have been present more strongly in Infinite and Burial at Sea Episode 1, but I don't agree. Booker and Comstock are killers, it's what they do. And it's what's best for the pacing of the game. The square footage that Episode 2 takes place in is extremely small, even compared to Episode 1, and the fact that the areas are balanced for slow, careful stealth gameplay tease these areas out into about 3 or 4 hours of gameplay. If the main game had been like that, if it had focused on stealth the same way that Episode 2 does, it would have been double the length and I would have had half the patience for it. But this is Elizabeth's story. It ought to be playable from a perspective that's truly appropriate for the character, and it is. Really, there's just 2 gameplay levels, both of them huge and beautifully done, but just 2. A Bathysphere dealership shopping concourse in Fontaine's department store in Rapture, and Fink's secret workshop back in Columbia, which you visit at the exact same time as when you visited Fink Factory in the main game, right at the moment that Daisy Fitzroy calls for Booker to die as an imposter of himself. You know, with the handyman fight. It's here in Episode 2, and going back to Columbia, that some of the episode's best and worst writing decisions are on display. They start with the worst. It's revealed that Daisy Fitzroy was not going to kill Fink's kid after all, that Lutesses convince her to fake it so that Elizabeth will kill her, giving Elizabeth the coldness she'll need to one day drown Booker. That's something that doesn't need tinkering with. The plot of hardening Elizabeth's soul through the murder of Fitzroy worked fine as it was, and I liked Fitzroy better when I thought she was really going to kill the kid. This was her moment of ultimate perfect revenge, and she got carried away by it. Doesn't Booker get carried away the same way when he drowns Comstock in the bird bath? Painting Fitzroy after the fact as more sensitive soul waters down her character a hell of a lot. I honestly don't know why they did it, especially since, like I said, Elizabeth's character arc would not change if they had just left it alone. The only justification I can figure is to account for versions of Fitzroy that might show mercy. The Lutece's involvement turned a possible variable into an absolute constant. It's a hedge. A very ham-fisted, irritating hedge against a question that people were not really asking. Then they refused to answer a question a lot of people were asking. What is Songbird? Man and machine, animal and machine, just a machine? As you make your way through Fink's lab, you'll find answers to how Fink and Comstock attempted to engineer Songbird from principles learned from Big Daddies, and how they attempted to bond Songbird to Elizabeth through scientific means. But to the question of what Songbird is, if there's a who Songbird was, Elizabeth asks the question, and the booker in her head asks, does it matter? I suppose that it doesn't, not ultimately, but it's worth knowing, and having that clarified would have been a damn sight better than spending time watering down Fitzroy. I did really enjoy how they played the pair bonding angle, though. It's only Elizabeth's compassion towards a broken Songbird when Songbird crashes into her tower when she was a child that created the bond. It adds a fascinating perspective to her conflicted relationship with Songbird. It cares about her because she cared for it, and it makes Songbird's death, already one of the most delicately melancholy moments in Infinite, even more tragic. That was a good call. I suppose they felt providing more answers about Songbird would have distracted from this, which is where they want the narrative emphasis to be, but one or two little voxophones wouldn't have hurt. The lingering question about the relationship between Columbia and Rapture that they do most satisfactorily answer is one of the ones that's been bugging people ever since the game's release. What is the relationship between Vigors and Plasmids? If you hadn't heard the audio logs and seen the chalkboards, let me briefly lay it out for you. Suchong, in Rapture, invented plasmids in injectable form. Fink, through the tears, came to find out about the sea slugs that produce Atom, but he couldn't get the injectable part down, so he invented drinkable plasmids, Vigors. Columbia's Vigors use Atom from sea slugs just the same as Rapture's plasmids do. Suchong, just as much of an egotist as Fink, spies Fink's research on drinkable plasmids and steals that from him with the thought that they'll be much easier to market and sell if you don't have to require people to stick needles in their veins. Then, Fink realizes that Vigors use about 10 times the Atom as the injectable model, and it would be prudent to develop the way that Suchong did it originally. He's trying to do so on his own, without Suchong's research, but Columbia was only a couple of years away from injectable Vigors when Fitzroy kills him. Meanwhile, in Suchong's lab, at the end of Episode 2, you'll find an audio log from Frank Fontaine to Suchong. Furious at finding out that drinkables are so much less efficient, he demands that the drinkables stop being produced and sold at once, and that they return to the injectable method. It's a pretty hilarious back and forth, actually, cleverly done and respectful of both timelines. It's one of the loose ends that Episode 2 tries to tie up that actually ends up feeling well and truly tied. Now, the main reason Elizabeth returned to Columbia at all was to acquire one of the Lutece particles, the things that hold Columbia in the sky in the first place. With it, Elizabeth can raise Fontaine's department store up from the ocean ravine that Andrew Ryan sunk it in and storm the city, starting with the Kashmir restaurant. This is where Episode 2 really starts playing around with the idea of connecting the old games to the new ones. Without Elizabeth's intervention, Fontaine would have rotted away in his luxury prison forever. Instead, he gets exactly what he wants. He gets to return to Rapture as Atlas, setting in motion the civil war whose results you bear witness to in Bioshock 1 a year later. Fontaine will not hold up his end of the bargain, though. He's positive that Elizabeth knows where his ace in the hole is, a secret weapon to defeat Ryan once and for all. Players of the first game can pretty easily guess exactly what that is. What's remarkable is how Burial at Sea ties together the personal story of Elizabeth, Comstock, and Booker with the political events of Bioshock 1. And that's always been one of the principal differences in world-building and narrative focus between the two games. Bioshock tackles the political, the ambitions of men, and the folly of hubris. And Infinite is about deeply personal, inevitable cycles of betrayal and pain, the bonds of family. We see that coming up. First, players have to experience a truly hard-to-bear torture scene where Fontaine, Atlas, whichever flavor you prefer, begins to perform a lobotomy on Elizabeth. On you, really. It's amazing how much you, the player, feel violated by it, and stops just short of piercing the skull entirely. A lot of reviewers are saying this is gratuitous. I'm saying it's not, and I'll tell you why. When Elizabeth drowns Booker, she disappears from existence as well. It's a death. But it's a painless death, a simple fading away, less a death than just an ending. It's the only way an omnipotently powerful being like Elizabeth at the peak of her powers can go out. What differentiates Elizabeth the woman from Elizabeth the quantum anomaly is her choice to become mortal, to see through the doors, know this torture was coming, and walk this path anyway. When the Paris dream collapses, you'll see a diagram of a transorbital lobotomy procedure and a wind chime of wrenches and an ace playing card with a Rapture lighthouse on it. Like with the conversation at the beginning of Episode 2, where the Booker hallucination tells you exactly what to say, there is only one way, one path to save Sally and redeem Elizabeth. Only one path that doesn't show her to be no better than her father, and you know every detail of that path already. Along that path lies the lobotomy. Elizabeth knew she would have to experience this terrible, terrible thing as a mortal woman to pay her debt, and still chooses to. That's not gratuitous, that's redemptive and heroic. Fontaine is a monster, but you've got to use him to save Sally. Part of that is allowing him to be monstrous, not to struggle, but to accept her part in the larger scheme. It's possible that they did what they did with Fitzroy just to let the Lutesses deliver the line of dialogue where they ask her what's more important, her part in the play, or the play itself. Elizabeth's suffering during the lobotomy scene is part of how she forms the answer to that question. The Booker in her head guides her to the answer about the ace in the hole. She's never been there, but she saw it back when the doors were open to her. The ace is in Suchong's free clinic in Olympus Heights. You know it, longtime Bioshock player. You've been there before. One of the most memorable audio logs from the first game is the one depicting Suchong's death. He's musing on how to properly pair bond the big daddies with little sisters, and the little sister is bothering him, demanding attention. He smacks her to shut her up. Then a big daddy plants a drill right through Suchong's ribcage, pinning him to the desk where he'll remain even a year later when the player comes across the log. Beryl at Sea maneuvers Elizabeth into position as the catalyst for this scene. She shows the little sisters how to show a little kindness to the big daddy, like she did with Songbird, and it's that kindness that forms the protective bond that Suchong accidentally breaks when he smacks the kid around. The ace in the hole is on the desk, untranslated by Elizabeth, but if you know your Bioshock, you'll know what it is immediately by the photo paperclipped to the bottom of the page. So you take the ace back to the clinic where Fontaine waits with Sally, and probably one of the best visually composed moments in the entire series. That last walk down the corridor to the expectant Fontaine is incredible in its dark and awful splendor. It hits every mood that the setting can evoke, the sadness, the grandeur, the feeling of inevitability and false choice. It's beautiful. I won't hesitate to say so. Darkly beautiful, but beautiful. The twist that the game's about to deliver isn't much of a twist if you've been paying attention, but it's a pretty perfect ending for the story that they've written. Fontaine was never going to give you Sally. He's a monster. You knew that as a player, and you knew that as a character. Yet you give him what he wants anyway. Why? Well, it's a really good why. Andrew Ryan called me a rube, Elizabeth says to Fontaine, but it's you who's the rube. The ace in the hole is the phrase, would you kindly, and Fontaine immediately sends his cronies out to use it to try to summon Jack, the player character from Bioshock 1, back to Rapture. Jack will be the death and downfall of Fontaine just as surely as he'll be, in the good ending, Sally's ultimate savior. Elizabeth is powerful to do anything herself, but she hands Fontaine his death just as surely as if she'd handed him a live grenade. He's doomed. He doesn't know it yet, but he's doomed. Sally isn't. After a final blow to the head from Fontaine's very familiar wrench, Elizabeth sees the reason she set herself down this path in the first place. Jack will save all the little sisters and leave Rapture to rot in the darkness forever. Sally will be among the survivors. The ending cutscene of Bioshock 1 is rendered in Infinite's engine, and Elizabeth witnesses Sally, restored to humanity, take her first tentative steps into the sunlight. We know from the original cutscene that all those girls will grow up loved, grow up to be the women they want to be. When I first played Bioshock 1, I thought that was just way too quaint and cutesy. In the context of Burial at Sea and Infinite, it broke my little heart. Elizabeth is finally free from guilt, her debt paid in full. Burial at Sea isn't about escape. It's about ending the cycles of exploitation and violence that plague the DeWitts. Booker and Comstock are, in their own ways, monsters both, but they can be redeemed. Comstock truly did care for Sally. Booker truly did care for Elizabeth. Elizabeth's rage and hatred for Comstock blinded her to that in Episode 1, and she was willing to exploit Sally to get that revenge. In doing so, she damned herself to follow in her father's footsteps. It left her with a debt that she repaid not only with her immortality, but her life in its whole. The sacrifice that she makes at the end of Infinite, on the grand scale, to drown Booker and vanish with him, allows Booker and Anna to have a chance at happiness. The sacrifice she makes at the end of Burial at Sea, on a personal level, allows Jack and Sally to have a chance at happiness. She dies knowing that she succeeded at this. Her Paris was a beautiful dream, but it was a dream, and the dreaming won't forgive the sins that she's committed. The reorchestration of the La Vie en Rose song from the opening, the bittersweet smile she gives Sally before she dies, it's an incredibly emotional ending, an incredibly clever ending, and an incredible balance between wrapping up plot and wrapping up character. It's the end of Infinite, the beginning of Bioshock. It's also the last game from Bioshock creator Irrational Studios. There's a lot of noise about the ending being, to quote a comment I read, fan-wankery about Bioshock, and I think that's a really false accusation. First of all, this is their project. Irrational Games created Bioshock, they created Infinite, they created Burial at Sea. They can do as they please, and the result is the final creation. It's not even about being masturbatory or nostalgic in the first place. The end of Burial at Sea is very much about the final act of Elizabeth's life and Elizabeth's character. It's personal, the same way Infinite was personal. All these tie-ins with the first game are secondary to what it's trying to accomplish. The twists and hidden connections between the games serve the characters, not the other way around. To be sure, there are plot holes I was hoping would get more satisfactorily resolved than they did, but Infinite was only ever truly concerned with telling the story of Elizabeth, Booker, and Comstock, and the same holds true for Burial at Sea. It got the ending it deserved, a bittersweet epitaph that cast the entire series in a new, more cohesive and comprehensive light. I think that's a wonderful accomplishment in game writing, and inconsistencies in the mechanics of the Infinite Universe setup don't detract from it much, if at all. Plus, it might not be the end of Bioshock as a franchise. 2K Games retains the right to make more Bioshocks, and, people might even be happier with those results than with Ken Levine at the helm. Bioshock 2 wasn't developed by Irrational after all, and it had some of the best gameplay and level design of the entire series. And its DLC, Minerva's Den, had an incredibly emotional twist climax that holds its weight very well compared to the Irrational-developed climaxes. Burial at Sea is, in my opinion, rather remarkable for how it dials back the problematic challenges of writing a story in a universe of infinite possibilities, reining them in and giving them truly meaningful conclusion. That's damn hard to do. And even if you argue with the elegance of the effort, I would encourage you to at least recognize the ambition. Thank you for watching. People who don't care about spoilers, though you should, and people who just want to hate-watch content about Infinite. Let's get into it. It's been a year since Infinite was released, and I still haven't seen any modern game provoke such an incredibly entrenched, divided response from the gaming community. There's a major disconnect between average players, who you'll find in the Steam review section and more casual review formats, and the parts of the gaming community who consider themselves more serious gamers and more serious game analysts. Namely, almost everyone I've talked to in person and the vast majority of Steam user reviews loved the game to pieces, had a wonderful time playing it, and are excited to see it reach its conclusion. Then there's an extremely vocal but sizable minority who hate Infinite without reservation or compromise. Not all of them. There's plenty of people like Aaron Signal's Campster who dislike Infinite for a lot of well-considered reasons, but there is a ferocity to the criticism of Infinite that I find bizarre. I talked for 30 minutes in my System Shock to Bioshock retrospective about why I think Infinite's a worthwhile game, and I'm not going to retread. But if we're going to talk about Clash in the Clouds, a combat-only DLC, we've got to talk about what people have been saying about Infinite in the year since its release. One of the most common criticisms about Infinite is that its combat is somehow shallower than previous games, influenced by Call of Duty, and lacking the strategic gameplay that previous titles had. No one really asked for Clash in the Clouds, and the fact that one of the essentially two pieces of DLC for the main game is totally divorced from the plot of the main game is a tremendous disappointment. But it does shake up the conversation about Infinite's combat systems, if you're willing to appreciate it as a playground of violence in which to more broadly experience those systems. Clash in the Clouds gives you 4 arenas in which to fight progressively harder waves of enemies, mixing up every variety of enemy in the game in a well-balanced assortment that requires the player to think very tactically about their environment and their strategies. Every weapon, upgrade, and vigor are available to the player between waves, and the latter two categories are available for purchase with money you'll earn beating the waves, looting enemies, and meeting special blue ribbon victory conditions. And most importantly, the difficulty is locked at hard. To prepare for Burial at Sea, I replayed Infinite in 1999 mode, and was delighted by how much it changes the dynamic of the game. If you play on normal or lower, it's understandable that you make a comparison to Call of Duty. You can get through the whole game using just iron previous System Shocks or Bioshocks. So, Clash in the Clouds. Locked in at hard difficulty, which is pretty close to 99 mode, you'll find yourself having to think very tactically about the arenas you're in, and how to juggle the different enemy types. You'll have to carefully choose your weapon loadout, attempt to stagger the pace at which you engage with the enemies, and if you find yourself amenable to the arcade nature of the DLC, Clash gives you the opportunity to really see Infinite's combat firing smoothly on all cylinders. Infinite's combat has always had a more fast-paced emphasis than previous Shocks, and after playing Clash in 1999 mode, I'm starting to feel that visceral immediacy of combat in Infinite is very much about the simplified level design. System Shock and Bioshock are about the environment first and foremost, telling a story through art and architecture as much as any explicit narration. Combat encounters, as a result, are arranged based on your engagement with the level architecture and the way that the player chooses to explore. Think of the introduction of spider splicers in Fort Frolic in Bioshock 1. Suddenly you've got a multi-story shopping concourse filled with dark corners and corpses that you have to explore thoroughly, so they hide live enemies among the corpses and throw enemies on the ceilings. Infinite is about the story. Exploration isn't the heights if you wanted, and if you're handy with games, you wouldn't really have much trouble doing so. The lower difficulties really are balanced towards casual players and those unfamiliar with shooters, which is great for those players. There's no reason to be elitist about a game making concessions for new or unskilled players. Infinite is plot-heavy and plot-dependent. If they didn't make it possible for the average to below-average players to finish that story, they'd really be shooting themselves in the foot. This game cost a lot of goddamn money to make, and they need those casual players to recoup the investment. So if you played on normal difficulty as a seasoned gamer, it's not going to be tactically demanding. 1999 mode throws all that out the window. It's not that 99 mode is extremely difficult, it's not. But it makes you much more vulnerable and much more dependent on exploration. When I played it on 1999 mode, I was astonished at how it changed the pacing of the game. I used traps more, I found exploration more rewarding, I finally bothered to learn vigor combos, and the pacing shifted towards something that much more closely resembles the original Bioshock. 1999 mode changes, mostly, how the game requires the player to engage with it, and changes it for the better. I didn't feel like combat was shallow when I played it on normal difficulty, but neither did it place the same tactical demands on the players. Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video we're going to be looking at the 3 pieces of downloadable content that have been released for Bioshock Infinite. Clash in the Clouds, an arena combat mode available for $5, and Burial at Sea Parts 1 and 2, which you'll find for $15 a pop. I'm going to be talking about how people feel about Infinite a year after its initial release as well. This video is just full of goddamn spoilers though, especially for Burial at Sea since I want to discuss the ending. Clash in the Clouds is mostly spoiler-free, but if you haven't played Burial at Sea, let me start off by saying that if you enjoyed Infinite, you will almost certainly enjoy its expansion and ultimate conclusion. And if you hated Infinite, there's nothing in Burial at Sea that'll change your mind. This video is intended for 3 audiences then. People who have played Burial at Sea,